The next one is that. This is the seal for the chain sprocket. A bit of oil around it. And the axle seals. And the next thing is to put the water pump onto the engine. Of course, first we have to replace that O-ring. I bought a new one. The code for the O-ring up here on the water pump, that's the one. Seals in place. Roll on the seat. On the O-ring itself, we need to check when we put it back in there the position of that tooth that attaches here, the tooth of the oil pump on the other side, because this is this goes and attaches on the axle of the oil pump. It's in that hole. See the plate? It has to be like that. We have to align our water pump just like that. Yep, done. This is the cylinder head after being resurfaced slightly and did a valve seat job. They cut the valve seats according to brand new valves that I provided for them. So everything should sit absolutely perfect without doing any valve lapping job and sit in place without losing anything. It's been cracked and leak tested, so there's no cracks in there somewhere. The surface is flat and everything is good to go. So let's put the valves on. Now we have brand new valves. We have inlet valves and exhaust valve. Now there is a bit of difference between the inlet valves, and the only difference between those two inlet valves, it's not the head. The head is exactly the same as far as they told me from the machinist place when they checked the valves onto the cylinder head. The only difference is that this is the side valve. This is a valve that goes on these two spots. How can you identify which what? You have to check in here. 3GM and it has two dots. If it has two dots, it goes on the side. It's not the center. It's one or the other of the side. It can go either. And these are 2 millimeters, 1.5 millimeters. That's 92.10 millimeters length, while this one, it says 3GM, but it has one dot on the side. Can you see? That goes always in the center. That's the center inlet valve. And this one is 90.5 millimeters. That's the difference. And of course the exhaust valves, which that's the new code for SV, that's the exhaust valve, and they're all the same. Yes, they are bigger than the inlet valves, but remember, the rule of thumb of inlet valves are bigger always than the exhaust valves, and this engine goes off the window because we have 3 inlet valves to compensate that intake. Start putting the valves together and then see if they leak. If they do, we have to do a lap job. Once you have lots of oil, afterwards we put brand new valve seals. That's the code. You put it in place really well. It will sit properly. You can hear the click on both sides. Once you hear the click on both sides, yeah, too much oil, but it doesn't matter, better more than nothing. Then you put the valve seat, the spring seat, sorry. Then you put the spring seat, make sure it sits in place nicely. How can you tell what's the top and what's the bottom of the spring? You see all the coils? See how distant they are from each other? That's the top. the shorter distance between coils, that goes at the bottom. That's how you know. So top, bottom. Make sure it sits nice on the top. And now this is the hard part. We need to compress the spring. Now if this seems to go and sit in there, it's a good idea to put some grease on the inside. So once we got them in there, they stick on the valve. Once we pull the spring upwards, it's going to come up and sit in place. Let's turn this one around. In place. Let's try to remove the spring compressor, and as we remove it, hopefully it's gonna put both wedges in place, and voila, seems to be okay. So let's go do a test. Let's put some kerosene into the inlet valves and see how good job he's done, or if we need to do a lap job. And look at that, amazing, no leak at all. And now we have to put the upper half of the cylinder head on top of the lower one. When you try to put the upper half with the springs of all valves on, it creates a mechanism that doesn't allow you to go in. Before you do that, make sure you haven't put any springs on the exhaust or the inlet, either side, doesn't matter. Just put springs on one side only. Once you put this on, then assemble the other side of the valves, in my case the exhaust valves. And of course you have to put a brand new gasket, which, that's the code. And that's the gasket, and the only way to go, of course you can see two holes back here, one over here, but which one is up and down? The one that reads up. Another detail you have to remember before you put one of the side of the valves and before you put the upper half of the cylinder head in here is to put the 8 bolts inside the cylinder head, not the outside of course, that they will tighten up the cylinder head on top of the cylinder barrel. And these are these ones. Try to show you with the camera. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7, 8. Before you put the upper half, you have to put them in there with their spaces. You have to put them in there, otherwise the upper half of the cylinder head, it doesn't allow you to do that later. All you have is a small hole to put here to put the Allen key to torque them, nothing else. So that's the time to do it, before you put the upper half. However, because these can go off place and can cause some dramas, you have to be very careful on how to manage the cylinder head left, right, up and down. Definitely don't go upside down, but a good idea is put some grease and then put some grease on the nut. And let's see one of the exhaust valves, that's the code. And now we have to put back all the shims, caps, the way it was before. That's why you need to do that at the beginning, before you dismantle everything. and mark which shim you have on top of each valve. Okay, let's do that. And then the plan is to put the inlet camshaft first, measure the gaps as I rotate with a spanner, measure the gaps, see what we have wrong, and we will put the actual shim that fits to make the correct gap. And the same we're gonna do for the exhaust. So I can see that's 172. Let me see if I have 172. Yes, I do have 172. I'll put it here. Make sure always you put them with the number upwards, the number to look upwards, not downwards, because the stem of the valve after so many RPMs is going to delete that number, and you have to use a micrometer to find out what's the gap. Make sure it sits nice and tight in there. If not, if you're not sure, just hit it with something like this, just slightly. Don't smash it, slightly. See, wobble. Now oil and put all these little pots in here. Just a bit of oil. Okay, now let's put the camshaft. And if you remember, inlet 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the fourth bearing cap. Number 2 and number 1. And measuring the valve gaps now, the current ones. Cylinder number 2 inlet, the cams are facing upwards, so it's the best moment to measure these gaps here. And because I could fit this one here, but I couldn't fit that here, so I bought a second filler gauge, cheapy one, and I just snapped them, cut the edges so they can fit through here or on the other side and be able to measure. Otherwise I couldn't do that. Not sure if there's any filler gauges that are thinner. I couldn't find any in the Australian market. So let's see, we have 1/10 of the millimeter. Let's check the first one. Just go through. Okay. Before I measure, I had to turn the camshaft one full spin, so all the valves, sims and pots can sit together, and whatever gap there was there to be disappeared. Otherwise, the first time I measured these valves, they were all way less than what they actually were, and when I did a second rotation I realized the gap was bigger. So make sure you do that. How do we turn the camshaft? Well, this part here is hexagonal, and you can use a long nose tool like this to turn it around. It's 22 millimeters, but most 22 millimeter spanners, they won't be able to do that because they stumble across the gasket face here of the cylinder head, and you might damage these ones, so you don't want that. So the most convenient for me was this little tool. Now I'm gonna do the third one. So let me show you exactly where you go. If I do it that way, not much space, but if you go behind it, there's far more better space. Okay, we're done with that. Now we have to remove this, see what we need, calculate, and put through that kit right here whatever we need. Now Yamaha has made it much easier having these charts, one for the inlet, one for the exhaust valves. Now this column here on the left, it represents the clearances that you have found. The top line across, it represents the seams that you have inside your motorcycle. So let's take the highlighted example. Let's say that you found a gap between 0.23 and 0.27. Let's say you found 0.23. You will have to come to this example, to this line as well, if you found 0.24, 0.25, 0.26 and 0.27. So let's say you found 0.23, and the installed is what you have in there, it's 150. Now we know that for inlet valves it has to be the gap between 0.11 to 0.20 millimeters. So since you have 150 in there, once you cross-reference these two, you will see which one you need to put inside. Remove the 150 and put 160. That will bring you back to the correct intake valve clearance. And of course the same goes for the example with the exhaust clearance, and let's follow the highlighted one as well. Let's say that you have a gap that is 0.33, which is above limits, since we know that the exhaust valve clearance has to be 0.21 to 0.30 millimeters. And let's say that you found that you have already a 175 seam. Once you cross-reference these two, you will see that you need remove the 175 and put a 185 to give you the correct valve clearance. Whoever doesn't have these charts, just shoot me an email and I can send them to you. So according to the Yamaha diagram that I showed you just before, I had 172 in here, and according to them, if you have a gap of 0.03 to 0.07 millimeters clearance before, and we had as much, we had 0.040, so we fell into that category, you need to put, instead of, and if you have a 172, which I had here, they don't mention 172 though, they mention about upgrades by 5. So they have 170, 175, 180, 185, but what they suggest is that if you have 72 or 71, you will have to consider it as 170, but if it's 173 or 74, you will then have to consider it 175, and that goes forth for all numbers. So I'll have to consider that 170, sorry, and they suggest that we have to put a 160, which indicates there's no 160, so I'm going to put a 625, And before you put it in there, just because it's full of lubricant that it's stuck on it, just spray a bit cleaner, with parts cleaner on a cloth. Wash off the dried oil on it, because it's going to affect the gap. You need that surface as clean as possible. Make sure you put the numbers upwards, as I said before. Otherwise, what's going to happen is the stem of the valve in there, it's going to destroy that number. And you need that number to know what exactly seam you have for the next adjustment, which is going to be hopefully in a very, very long time. Just push it there with your fingers, and then with something plastic or something soft, tap it in there, make sure it sits properly. Oil the pot and put it back in place. Let's go for the next one. The seam is in there. Remove it to see what number it is, even though I have the numbers written on a piece of paper. And this is 182. Not sure if you can really see it. 182. And we have to consider 182 as a 180, as I said before. So since we have a 0.40 gap there, we have to put a 170. You can use the old sims, and we need 170 here. That's 172 considered to be 170. And that's what we are going to put in there. Bit of oil. Back in place. Next. Now we have a clean piston to put the piston rings on, which are these. And this is the code for the standard pistons. They're not oversized, they're just standard pistons for FZR1000. I could put the old ones, there was nothing wrong with them. I measured the gap, the clearance on the end gap, and it was absolutely within specs. Actually was spot on. But since I already ordered these, why not? It's been a while since I put brand new piston rings. The top one, first compression ring, that's the second one. And these are the oil rings, which is one ring in 3 different parts as usual. That little arrow always indicates the exhaust side of the piston, so it shows towards the exhaust valves. In this case it's much easier because you can see we have 3 valves inlet, which you have the marks on the piston, and 2 exhaust. But that's another reference. For example, 2-stroke engines, they have an arrow or a triangle shaped to indicate exhaust. Now we have 3 pieces of oil ring to put in here on the last groove, and we have to put that first, otherwise we can't overlap easily. Then we put the second compression ring, and finally we put the top compression ring. Regarding the position of the end gaps of the piston rings, it's quite important. Yamaha gave us this diagram. As you can see, numbers 1, 2, 3 and 4 symbolize where the end gap of every piston ring it has to be. Now number 2 is the lower oil ring that we have to put first, after we put of course the expander. That's where it goes. And number 3 is the second oil ring, the upper oil ring. They have to be 180 degrees apart. Now after that we have to put number 4, which is the second compression piston ring, and that has to go on the other way. And of course number 1 is the first compression ring, and it has to go 180 degrees opposite the second one. This is to avoid compression leaks. And as you can see, these end gaps, they have 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 in between them, about 25 degrees. It's quite impossible to manage to get it in exactly 25 degrees. You can do it roughly, you don't have to be exactly accurate. Also remember that at the end, after all the touching and the moving of the pistons, Before you put the pistons into the cylinders, remember to do a last final check, because I'm pretty sure because of all the touching and moving they're gonna be all moved around. First you have to put the base oil ring, which is that. Now the end gap, because in every other piston, like I said, they have to, in every other piston ring they have to go all the way like this. Then this one will go like that. The top ring has to go 180 degrees on the opposite direction, the end gap. So since we have that and that occupied, you can't put this either there or there. So it's a good idea to put it either here or here, 90 degrees away from the alignment of these rings. So let's put that first on the last groove. Make sure it doesn't overlap. That's where it is. Then you put the bottom one, which we want it to be somewhere there. Now if you can see, I put it right under it, and the gap is somewhere there. Now the next one has to go 180 degrees, so since we have that over here, that end gap has to end up somewhere here, 180 degrees. And I managed to put it right where I wanted. Kinda. It's a bit further, I'm gonna turn it around a bit, but I can do that later. Now, as far as concerns these two rings, the harder is the second and the softer is the top one. As for the second, you need to find out where exactly the marks are, and the second one will have the marks RN right here, so that RN has to face top of the cylinder. Now the top one supposedly has to have marks, but sometimes they don't. It's the older piston rings on Yamaha FZR1000 that they have a mark, and it was the letter R. If you find the letter R on yours, it has to face upwards. If you don't find any letter, which like mine they don't have any, it's gonna go either way, that or that. Whatever side goes top or bottom, it doesn't matter, because if you check the thickness, there's no different pattern, so it can go either way. So put the pistons. First we need to put a bit of oil, lubricate in here as well, both sides. Then you push the piston inside the rod, push all the way in, and then the circle, and of course the circle there, make sure it won't fly away, because you're gonna lose it, and especially now if it falls inside the engine, I'm done. That's why it's a good idea always to put a screwdriver in there. Fourth cylinder. Now let's put the cylinders, but before we do that, let's put the gasket. That's the code, and let's put it on. And the only way to sit properly up is be able to read. That's it. That thing goes up like this. And now let's put the cylinders. Time to put the O-rings here. These ones, all four of them. Just a bit of grease or silicone grease. carefully, push them back into place without pushing them too much. The gasket will do the rest of the job. You just make to show you push them that much in, so once you turn them upside down, they won't fall down. So we do the fall down test. All in place, so all good. Remember, that goes at the back of the engine. Remember to include the tensioner. And at last, the time for putting the cylinder head on is here. And of course we have to put the gasket code. Since we have the surface clean, we're gonna put the new gasket, and we all know by now how to set up the correct, which side goes up and down. The one that says up. The pin dowels are in place. No glue, no nothing. And now we're gonna bring the cylinder head and put it on top.